Well, good morning and good afternoon. We do have a global audience with us, as we often do in our webinars. So for those of you who have heard my voice before, welcome back. For those of you who are hearing it for the first time, my name is James Amsler, and I run sales for GlassIG. And we scheduled our time for an hour today. I don't think we'll take quite that, but our topic is managing your information inventory and doing so in a way that accommodates the various challenges related to regulatory requirements and GDPR, et cetera, related to metadata. So it's going to be very light on presentation and a little heavier on demonstration than our previous webinars have been. Before we get into that, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, this is a WebEx, and WebEx, among other things, provides the ability for this to be interactive. So we've muted all your lines, but nevertheless, we'll invite you to register any questions or comments in the chat window, which is being monitored in the background. And I'll pause periodically here and there to see how we're doing there, and if there are any questions that I can answer as we're going through, then I will. And if there are any that require a deeper dive, then we'll follow up with you afterwards. And second, our session today is being recorded, so those of you who are, well, who haven't dialed in now but are hearing this after the fact, thank you for doing so, and please reach out to us if you've got any questions that arise as you're going through. As I said, my name is James Amsler. I run sales for GlassIG. Who and what is GlassIG? Well, just quick introduction, because there are a few unfamiliar names who've joined us today. GlassIG is a software company based in Geneva, Switzerland, specializing in an information governance platform. This information governance is all we do. The company, GlassIG, is fairly new, a little over a year old. The technology is not. What you're going to see today has been available. My apologies. The technology you're going to hear today, you're going to see today, has been available for since about 2010, and it was the first information governance platform for actively enforcing policy across multiple repositories. So our customers now are engaging us both via our SaaS, cloud-based kind of subscription model, where they simply go to the website and subscribe, and away they go, and then our traditional kind of on-premise deployments as well. We are global, so some of you, as I've already said, are dialing in from Europe. We have a very large presence in Europe. Our corporate headquarters, in fact, are in Geneva. But I'm speaking to you from North America, and we have a significant presence here and partners elsewhere around the globe. Those of you who have dialed in before, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I'm big on stories. All of our webinars, I feel like I'm telling stories, and I'm using concepts and, when necessary, our technology to help me tell the story. So here's today's story. And I want to differentiate sort of how it has traditionally been done versus today's environment. So traditionally, we would have maybe a corporate records manager or a records manager that sort of owned the responsibility for managing information and for sort of defining the rules, and it's kind of a one-stop shop for that. And in fact, for decades, that's how it was. The first time that I got a sense for this changing was in the fall of 2011. I was in Schaumburg, Illinois, suburban Chicago, and I was visiting with the corporate records manager for a very large financial services company whose North American operations are based there. And he said, you know, I get so many requests to find this, where's that, what's the rule for this, how do I manage that? He said, I get so many kind of ad hoc requests that I don't have time to do my day job. I feel like a librarian, he said. Well, the challenge there was that they had information kind of sitting all over the place and a different way of accessing it all. And he was the only one that sort of had his finger on the button for all of those. Well, that's now the state of things today, is that not only do information managers have those kinds of responsibilities, but in fact everybody does. Those of us who are content creators, IT people who are in charge of making sure that the systems are up and running and operational. The data itself has constraints that are driving us. And we've got both internal and external customers that are giving us, well, not just data, but also requests to use that data, or are providing use cases in which that data is necessary. So in the end of the day, what to do is always a business decision. And this was one of the things that I think was lost when corporate records managers and others like them sort of could be funneled away in their own little world. So how do we make that business decision? Well, we weigh the various inputs and requirements that are driving what we do and how we respond to these requests. So on the left, we've got a series of technical requirements that I've got information sitting in Centera and Share Drives and SharePoint and Box.com and Google Drive and here on my local machine. Anyway, so we've got information sitting all over the place in many different types, some of it well structured and understood, some of it completely without any context whatsoever. And from that information, we have the need to potentially extract metadata for e-discovery purposes, for business purposes, for any number of reasons. And that information could be structured, it could be unstructured, it could be a series of rows in a database that need to be archived into. Anyway, so we've got a bunch of technical requirements that are not always that in some cases are mutually exclusive, and sometimes that they sort of contradict each other. Meanwhile, we've got some functional requirements, which are really the key drivers. Regulatory, business, the need to find information because I'm a customer relationship manager and there are 6 incidents sitting in front of me, and I've got an angry customer and they're seeking some resolution, and I need the context and background of that. And then policies that associate all those. So the information manager, which I made the point a moment ago, is now all of us, sits at sort of the confluence of these technical and functional requirements. And the traditional approach, wherein I define a retention schedule and I enforce it in SharePoint, and then I use FileNet records management to enforce it there, and I use Box.com's record management capabilities. This traditional approach is no longer sustainable. It's too difficult. You're very much like the person that I met with in Schaumburg who can't do their day job because they have too many ad hoc requests to address. This is what brought our technology into being. I mentioned a moment ago that Glass was the industry's first information governance platform for active policy enforcement across multiple systems. And now here we are 8 years later, and we've extended that approach to cloud-based repositories, and also the ability to just get going in a matter of minutes by defining your policies and actively enforcing those. So I apologize, as I often do on behalf of the vendor community, for the fact that we haven't standardized on what information governance means. And so to us, 3 aspects of it. What are the policies that apply to your information assets? In fact, what are those information assets and where do they reside? And then governance is the means for enforcing those policies on your information assets and gaining some visibility into how that's going to make ongoing policy decisions. At the end of the day, the business outcome is that risks are mitigated, processes are more efficient because people have the information they need at their fingertips. You've made decisions about managing your information that accommodate both the risks and the value and the costs. So this is what our customers are deriving. So back to today's topic now. If we're going to weigh these technical and functional requirements back and forth in order to manage information in a compliant way, get access to the content that we need, filter very narrowly if there's that needle in the haystack we're looking for, how do we go about doing that? Well, at Glass, we take a 3-step approach. The first begins in policy. Everything for us begins in policy. And policy traditionally is retention schedule, but over time has broadened. And in fact, the GDPR session that we did a couple of months ago brought into focus the fact that policy must account for storage rules, privacy restrictions, not just retention and disposition, but in fact what happens during the potentially decades-long life cycle between those two milestones. So GLASS provides the ability to define policies and define policy attributes that allow you to understand what applies where, which business, which organizational node, what are the security roles that that sort of define who can access what, and in fact who can change what, who needs to approve, and et cetera. So in just a moment, we'll get started with how these sorts of questions are answered with GLASS policy management capabilities. Once you define your policies, though, I said a moment ago that information governance, the governance aspect is applying, that is actively enforcing your policies on your information assets. Traditionally, what that meant was taking your policies and sort of exposing them inside whatever records management or retention or other types of governance capabilities are present in the repository. And this was sort of a kind of a hit and miss proposition, because some systems, I'll take SharePoint 2007 as an example, that was DoD 5015 certified. And so it met the records management capabilities requirements that were specified there. Now it did so in kind of a clunky way, and required that you set up a record center and manage the relationship between the sites in the record center. But hey, it met the requirements. But because it was not very friendly, when SharePoint 2010 came out, they did not seek, and in fact were not DoD 5015 compliant, and haven't been ever since, which allowed a whole cottage industry of consultants and other types of entities to spring up to make your SharePoint system compliant. So likewise, FileNet, Documentum, OpenText, when it existed, Autonomy, they each had their own means for defining retention, and in a couple of cases, some other types of policies. So GLASS says, no, that's not the way to do that. And it's even more complex now when you've got shared drives and some cloud-based repositories that have no means whatsoever for defining policies, for actively enforcing them. Google, for example, Google Drive has no means for that, and some shared drive technologies have no means for that. So, so what we've done, the policy that you set up in step 1 using GLASS is actively enforced across all of your content systems, wherever your information assets reside, which then gives you, in addition to policy management and enforcement, retention of lifecycle, et cetera, it also gives you the ability to find things, to be very fine-grained in terms of searching across metadata or types of information assets, dates, et cetera. So the second piece that I'll show you here in a moment is how to take that policy, enforce it across your information assets, and then use the visibility across all of your repositories, across all of your governed systems, in order to meet those regulatory requirements and business searches. There's a third step. We won't really get into it today, but it involves the ability to extract meaning from unstructured content. We've got some simple abilities to do that where it exists, but oftentimes customers will say, look, I've got multiple terabytes of garbage. I was going to use a stronger word, and I checked myself there, of garbage that's just sort of sitting out all over my enterprise. I've got 32 shared drives here. I've got these people over here that set up their own repo, and I know nothing about what's anywhere. So in those cases, we've got some technology and other types of partners that allow visibility into that content and then feed it back to us, feed it back to GLASS including, when necessary, extracting metadata that's necessary for search and governance purposes. It's not a use case I'm going to get into today from a demonstration perspective, but I didn't want to ignore it because it is so common. And I know several of you who have dialed in today, I've talked with you, and I know that you're fighting these challenges now, that you've got some antitrust concerns and other types of issues that have frozen your organization because you just don't know what information you have and where it may or may not be impacted by some of those litigation activities. So again, not going to say much more about it than this. I am going to go into demo mode here in a second, but before I do, I am going to pause and take a look at the chat window and kind of see where we're at and see if there's any questions or comments on what we've seen and discussed so far. All right. Well, a couple related to audio. Okay, I think we're good. And then one person says, demo already. All right, fine, we'll do that. So as I said earlier, Glass is it's a cloud-based technology. So in fact, a lot of our customers, in fact, they simply begin at the website, and if you click on sign up for free, and if you've never done that, I encourage you now to do that. It takes you to a sign-up page where you provide some information, and then when you click on sign up for free, the gremlins in the background kind of create your Glass instance right there for you, and away you go. It really is kind of that simple. So most of our customers, actually, this link right here, where it says login, they've just got that saved. And that's what my page is right now. So I'm going to be an information professional right now, a Glass user, someone who is in charge of making sure information is managed according to a policy, and that's all I'm going to say about that, because as I've said before, we're kind of all information managers today. Well, here's my landing screen, and this is not going to be a deep dive demo. I think the majority of you have already experienced an introduction into Glass, and for those of you who haven't, I welcome you reaching out to us and asking for it. But that said, I will at least kind of introduce you to what you're seeing here. So we're big on landing pages. My landing page shows me how many information assets are under governance, and right now I see a very small number. You may scoff at the idea of only having 6,600 information assets, but for demonstration purposes, which is exactly what this is, it suffices. And I see that some of them are under legal hold. Many of them are works in progress, unprotected assets, but they are known by Glass and being managed according to a policy. And some of them are declared records. In Glass parlance, we say that those are protected. The most recent items that have been ingested, that is cataloged by Glass, be they in SharePoint, 2010, 2016, Office Share Drive, whatever, I see that they're here. We're also big on collaboration and review and approval, and I see that some policies are waiting for my approval. I can't imagine what that would be. I'm kind of a humble person, and yet something is out there waiting for me to approve it. And it's interesting. Most of our customers, and perhaps you're this way, well, I know some of you are, you have always and forever retained every information asset that your company has ever produced. We have some customers that maintain records from the 1800s just because it's their corporate culture to do so. So imagine going from that mindset to now having a system like Glass that is sort of silently working in the background to enforce your policy. That's a pretty abrupt cultural shift, and one of the ways that our customers address that transition is by putting review and approval processes in their policy, so that nothing happens until someone, a custodian, an end user, even a business user, a paralegal, or perhaps multiple someone's, sign off on the action. And so I see that 50 information assets have reached their disposition period, and they're waiting for me to sign off on that. And well, I could click on them and see what they are, and here they are, but I'm going to keep them as they are so that I can continue to make this point to others for demonstration purposes. Let's refocus. Let's go back to our topic of the day, and that is managing your information inventory. I made the point earlier that starts with policies. And our user interface is sort of aligned to kind of progress in that way. So I'm going to click on policies. If and when you become a Glass customer, your instance will come pre-populated with a set of policies that are organized functionally. So we advocate that approach, and I think that argument's been won there, as opposed to organizationally. A few customers still like to have their information policies set up according to organizations, but our take is that the functions are much less likely to evolve and change over time than organizations will. Organizations being much more fluid. And so, for example, if I click on administration, then underneath administration are some common types of information classes that we would see. So if I click on leases, for example, then the rest of the screen populates with the policy for managing lease documents, lease information assets related to corporate leases. And right now, this policy is in draft status. It hasn't been published out. So I see, for example, the life cycle has 3 major events. One is, as soon as a document is created, then a timer begins to click, and it does so for 10 years, at which point a review and approval process gets kicked off, that same thing that I showed you a moment ago. And when that review and approval process is completed, then the deletion action will take place. So that's basically the retention. This is an event-based retention period. But there are 2 other life cycles. One is that the content itself will be indexed for full text search purposes as soon as the lease document is declared as a record. And oh, by the way, that declaration event is also going to tick off a timer wherein a year later the lease information asset will be moved to a dedicated preservation center. And who knows what that is? That could be, right now, that could be Centera. A year from now, that could be Amazon S3 or some other less expensive storage area that is still governed by Glass, and so therefore the information asset would still be available as part of the inventory that I'll show you later. So just in this, I haven't even done anything. I've only showed this to you, but this is extraordinary, that I've got a policy that will apply to my lease documents that includes retention, full text search indexing, and archiving, and Glass will be the means for orchestrating all of that. All right, so, but lately, within about the last 18 months or so, we've had the notion of policies and properties related to the policies themselves, not necessarily the information assets. So let me explain what I mean by that. We certainly have metadata, and we'll get into metadata handling in a moment, where maybe I've got a contract document, or since I'm looking at leases, lease documents, and maybe there's maybe I'm leasing a piece of equipment, and the equipment ID, that's a piece of metadata. But that piece of metadata is specific to the lease document or the lease record. Likewise, if I'm leasing property, maybe I've got a property ID or an address or something. Well, so that's one set of descriptors. Another set of descriptors, though, are related to the policy itself, because we have some very large customers for whom they have sort of divided responsibility for managing different areas of the retention schedule and different areas of the policy. So in some cases, this is geographic. So imagine if I've got a corporate records manager that has a team of maybe 6 regional record managers, and each of them, one of them is responsible for managing the retention schedule for content for our operations in the Philippines, and then someone else for Canada, and someone else for the UK. So you can imagine that. But also we've got customers who divide responsibilities for policy according to what the policy actually is. So security, for example, might be under the purvey of the CISO, and storage maybe is in IT, and the retention is the corporate records manager, and legal citations would be. So those are properties that are related to the policy itself. And so in this case, I see that my counterpart, Adnan, owns this particular policy. He has decided or recorded that lease information could potentially include personally identifiable information. And this is important for us to understand for GDPR purposes which policies, which information assets may be sensitive from a GDPR aspect and which may not be. Are my lease documents required for business continuity purposes? Adnan says no. And is there a master copy owner? And Adnan says no. So these properties could be defined on a policy level. And how to do that, I'm going to click on Advanced Policy Management. That gets me to sort of the working space for that level. And as it does so, I'm going to take a quick look in the chat window and see if there are any questions so far. Okay. All right, there's a question related to, do I have to use your retention schedule? So the answer, let me answer that quickly, no. And then I'm going to table the rest of that when we get back into the view, and I'll show you how to use yours. Okay, here, the screen I showed you earlier is intended for kind of Glass users in general, information managers, paralegals, etc. But if you think about it, those who author and approve policy, that's a pretty small group of people. We're not talking the entirety of the employee population. And usually, even in our largest customers, this is a very small group. We're talking perhaps someone representing the general counsel and the corporate records manager, and maybe someone in security, compliance, risk, but maybe a dozen people at our largest customers. And by the way, our largest customers are kind of household names, giant entities that you would have heard of. So this view, this interface is for those people. And again, landing pages, I see the recent legal requirements that have been added. That one policy that's waiting for my review and approval, I see it again here. In this case, it actually tells me it's HR benefits. I'm not going to do a deep dive into policy management. We've done it before in previous webinars, and I'd be happy to do that for any of you that would like that. In fact, it's one of my favorite things to do. But instead, I'm going to narrowly focus on this notion of properties and also of legal requirements. First, let's go back where we were in the master classification. A little shortcut, I can just click on leases and it will take me straight there. And in fact, this is the same information you saw a moment ago here in the simplified portal, only it's a deeper look at it. So leases, the life cycle, 10 years, delete with validation, you saw that already. The other life cycle events, if I click on the life cycle tab, I'll see those milestones. And if I wanted to change them, maybe for example, we're not going to archive 1 year, but maybe 5 years, and instead of after record, after an appeal order or something like that, business events. So I'll keep those, or I'll cancel those changes. The laws and regulations tab allow me to draw a relationship between the legal requirements, for example, the electronic. Whoops, I need to select it. The Electronic Transactions Record Act. And allows me to draw a link between the legal requirement and the policy itself. So therefore, later, if an auditor or maybe my compliance manager wants to know how I can prove that I'm aligned with my legal requirements, I can say, well, I've got a bunch of policies that are mapped to those laws and regulations, and I'm actively enforcing content according to that policy. That's a powerful statement to make to an auditor or compliance agent. How most of our customers do that today is they simply entrust a third party, or they manage this according to multiple spreadsheets. They've got a spreadsheet with their legal requirements, another with their retention schedule, maybe a third that kind of includes those relationships. So anyway, all right, metadata. we've already got just kind of standard metadata related to content indexing, because you saw earlier one of the milestones is that we write content index entries. But I've also got this notion of properties related to the policy, and let's go there. So if I've defined a metadata group of those policy attributes that you saw earlier. Who's the policy owner? A moment ago, you saw that Adnan owns leases. Maybe I own something useless. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. Maybe I own something else like HR or research and development or something. Does this particular information class can possibly, certainly, or no possible way include personally identifiable information? Is it necessary for business continuity? Master copy. So once you define these and apply them to the various information assets, then that enables a whole set of additional capabilities, which are the rest of the demo. Before I get into that, I want to get to the question that was asked. Do I have to use your retention schedule? And the answer is not only no, but in fact, almost nobody does. We supplied this particular hierarchy, this sort of pre-built set of classifications, mainly because we were asked to. The first couple of customers, first maybe dozen or so that signed up, the policy was empty, and they weren't able to sort of kind of get a feel for it until they started actually kind of creating things. And so we said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll populate Glass instances with sort of a generic classification, and that's what you're seeing here today, and that's what we use for demo purposes. You see this button over here on the right, though, import policy. Most of our customers have a retention schedule and other sort of information classification that they want to use as the basis for their governance project. Sometimes that is a very large classification. We have customers that have, this is only a 2-node hierarchy. We have some customers that have 4-node hierarchies with over 10,000 nodes in the classification. And although it's pretty easy to just simply write a policy, it probably takes about 90 seconds. Well, 90 seconds times 10,000 is a very large chunk of time. So therefore, they click on the import policy button and ingest their spreadsheet into the system. And that gets populated into the environment, and away they go. Be happy to show that to you if you want to see it in action. All right, so a couple other questions before I go on. All right, someone has asked, are there any limitations to the number of policy properties? And so let's go back here and answer that question. No, there's no limitation. I have 4 that touch very broad areas of policy. You know, personally identifiable information. This is very much of a GDPR type of scenario. Policy owner, I'll admit most of our customers don't assign policy owners, and so they it really makes sense for those in sort of geographically what's the word I'm looking for here? Dispersed organizations where you've got folks that need to collaborate on policy but are perhaps not within the same roof, and so this is one way to assign ownership, and then later for filtering purposes to see, okay, who owns what, and you can report off of that. Business continuity, I think, is pretty clear. Master copy. So maybe you've got other types of properties. There could be, perhaps related to the different compliance requirements you have to fit, different governing bodies, geographies, business units. When we've got financial services organizations that over the last decade or so have acquired businesses of multiple types. So, those could all be property policies or policy properties that you specify in order to make the collaboration easier. All right, here's another question. Changes in laws. All right, so let's talk about, it's a deeper look into this than I intended, but I think it matters. So the question is, how do we accommodate changes in laws? So if I have cited the Australian Privacy Act, for example, and I've got some record classes associated. All right, so in this case I don't, but if I did, and then this is updated, let's pick a different example. Let's take the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So I see that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act includes a maximum retention of 25 months. I'm not an attorney. I don't know that that's actually true, but let's go with it. Let's assume that that is. And I've got a series of record classes, personal credit applications, that have been mapped to that legal requirement. Well, yay, I can tell my compliance officer that we've cited that particular statute as part of the policy definition, and we're managing content in concert with it. But what if it changes? Well, the view record classes, among other things, gives me a laundry list, if you will, of changes that I'm going to need to make to the policy, so that if instead of 25 months, the updated citation says, 3 years or something different, then I'll know that I'll have to update the corresponding policy. Okay, back to the story, and I'm loving the questions, and I'm loving the interest in the policy deep dive. I'm going to move on from them though, because there's still more of the story that I want to tell in the time that we've got. And in fact, I feel like let's go back to here. So you've got policy set up, and among other things, you've got the now that you've set the policy up, you can now do searches of your inventory according to those policy properties, potentially also according to metadata, etc. So how does that work? Well, in Glass, I mentioned that the user interface is set up according to sort of the progress of your project. So the next question to answer is, where are my information assets? Where is my stuff? Where are my documents and records sitting? We call those info sources. And we purposefully use a very generic word there, because in some cases they are traditional repositories, Documentum, FileNet, ECM systems, etc. In some cases they're collaboration spaces. Many would argue that's what SharePoint is. Cloud-based repositories, shared drives. There's not a single word that describes all of these different types of environments. Archives, like S3 or Centera. So anyway, so we use the word info source as a generic word that said, so if you're a Glass customer or become one, you will purchase, as part of your license subscription, the connectors relevant for the systems that you want governed. And once you do that, you'll see those as part of your info source list. So here I've already got info sources for Google Drive, SharePoint Online, we're seeing that more and more, Box.com, shared drives. Almost every customer includes shared drives as part of their governance landscape, I'll call it. So SharePoint 26, etc. So I've got some existing info sources, not going to set any up. But so once you tell Glass where your information is, the next step in applying your policies, in enforcing your policies on that content, is to create what we call a cataloger. And as it says, a cataloger is basically a process that periodically takes a look at where you have said information resides and looks for things to govern, things that need to have a policy applied to it. So one of the ones that I created earlier, here, it's sorted according to owner. Here's one, SharePoint credit applications. In fact, I've got a SharePoint server sitting in the background. This is SharePoint 2010. I see that there are little tiny locks on there, and that the GlassIG has recognized that they exist, and in fact, according to policy, has locked them down as records, as personal credit applications. So that's what the cataloger does. It defines how often Glass is going to look for things. Is it going to look for things weekly or every 30 minutes or what have you? And then when it finds something that it hasn't placed under governance before, that it applies the policy to it, and if necessary, locks it down as a record in the way we've done with these items, or just leaves them as cataloged unprotected items. That's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going to create a cataloger right now. Again, that's a deeper dive for another day if you'd like it, and if you would, I welcome the opportunity to do that. Instead, we're going to skip to the next piece in the story. You set up your policies, you set up your info sources, the catalogers apply those policies to your information assets, and once things are under governance, then wow, that story of the corporate records manager in the Chicago area where all he does is go to his various repositories and find things for people or answers questions that people know that he's the only one who knows. Well, if he had this, which in 2011, well, I guess he could have, but this is sort of the answer to that scenario. So let's say, for example, I need a very broad search. Show me everything related to Acme. You know, as a kid, Bugs Bunny, awesome. In fact, I grew up thinking that Wile E. Coyote was actually ordering things from a real company called Acme, and only later did I find out that that's actually not true. Well, anyway, so fine. So I do a search for Acme, and everything related to Acme, regardless of whether it's a personal credit application, something related to investor relations. Notice I don't even care whether these are SharePoint or Box.com or ShareDrive type things. Glass doesn't care. To them, to Glass, these are information assets managed according to a policy. And so if I need to be very fine-grained, I can do that. And then once I've got items in the result list, I can do all sorts of things. You know, place them on hold. Here, let's deselect. I can access them. I can understand if there's any metadata that applies. In this case, the answer is no. So great, wonderful. Let's reset. Let me be more fine-grained. Let me say, no, I don't want to execute a broad course search. I am looking for something very specific. And this is where those properties, those policy properties come into effect. If I wanted, for example, to find, you know, show me everything that's being managed according to, actually, I don't know if we'll have anything under administration, but I do know we've got some things. Show me everything that's being managed according to corporate record applications. Reset all. Oh, I'm sorry. It pulled up everything related to Acme that was being managed according to that. So let's try that again. Sales, corporate credit applications, choose, search. Yeah, see, so a moment ago, since Acme was still up there, it showed me everything that Glass understood to be a personal credit application. I'm sorry, a corporate credit application from Acme. So in this case, once I remove Acme, then I see that I've got you know, a large number of items, and in fact, this case 22. And again, once those are up, then I can take some various actions on them. I can see the various status, where they are. This is on the share drive, for example. When it was cataloged, all sorts of interesting information. Let me reset again. So that's if I wanted to execute searches according to policy or the various attributes related to policy. What about metadata? So here I'm going to click. Let's narrow down a little bit. So assets, and maybe I want to search for every credit application that is asking for $10,000 in a credit line. That's a pretty fine-grained search, isn't it? And so in this case, I see that I've got 3. And if I wanted to know more information about them, then great. I can see what the records are. Pojo Smith on April. Okay, someone's playing a joke on me there. Anyway, so fine. Pojo Smith on April 28th of 2018 placed a personal credit application, and it's been cataloged, has not been locked down. It's not under legal hold. So this one here is on the share drive, and if I wanted to click on the asset, then I could. So what questions are we answering here? Well, let's go back to this scenario, and it's this one right here, where I have all sorts of requirements, some of which are, gosh, I'm losing the word, but are sort of mutually exclusive. So the need to retrieve content according to metadata. E-discovery use cases where I'm looking for things related to a potential matter or everything related to Acme or et cetera, regardless of where it might be across multiple systems or what type of format. This was an RTF file that it found over here, but you know, what if it's a TIFF or a DocX or whatever? So, well, Glass doesn't care, because to us, the business decisions rely on sort of the intersection of those technical requirements being managed against the business and regulatory requirements that drive policy, that constantly evolve, and that require that you actively enforce that as your inventory grows, as content is created, and shrinks as it's disposed. So this is not necessarily, I don't want to make this just a GDPR thing. GDPR is one of the primary drivers that's making people pick up the phone and call us, so fine. There certainly are a lot of GDPR questions we're answering here, but it's broader than that. This story we're telling, as I said earlier, I've been hearing it since 2011, and that was unlikely. That was certainly not the first time that someone felt that need to manage all these different requests and drivers. All right, I've covered the content that I want, so I'm gonna go to the end here and again encourage you to create your account so you can get your hands on this for free and spend your own time on it. We're happy to provide whatever guidance. If there are aspects of policy or creating info sources or cataloging content that you felt like you were kind of cheated on today, well, you were, first of all, and second, I'd be happy to go into more detail on that at your convenience. And also that scenario where we're extracting metadata using a third-party technology. We're kind of building something with a partner right now on that, and I'd be happy to go into that on another time. All right, so that said, I am going to take a look. My colleagues on the marketing team have been managing the requests and feedback in the chat window, and so I'm now kind of reaching out to them right now to see if there's anything that's not addressed. All right, so there's a GDPR question. I'm going to get to your GDPR question offline, if you will, because that's first of all, that we do have a webinar on GDPR from back in, I think it was April, and second, I think I'd rather answer you directly. Can you imagine the policy? Okay, so yes, there's a question related to event-based policy. So to set the context for that, let's go back to the advanced policy management view and that master classification. So if you recall, leases are an event-based life cycle, or at least the disposition period. At least the disposition period is that after creation. So basically, assigning a document value is a creation for us. You can call it whatever you want. That's part of the policy, is to define those various events in your own vocabulary and your own terms. So then 10 years later, delete with validation. So what if instead of a document-related event, we're really talking more of like a business event, like receiving a credit application? Can you the question is, can you intercept event triggers and automatically trigger the lifecycle? And the answer is yes. So at the policy level, when you define those various events as part of your policy, they then become available in the drop-down list to define the lifecycle. That's at the policy. When it comes to enforcing the policy, so let's use the example of the credit application, because I think that one actually does have an event-based policy already assigned to it. Application received, there we go. So 25 months after the application received event, and this one actually has been published, so I'm going to have to click on create a new version to go into read-write mode. The little pencil appears, and now this is where I find those various events. So now when we're talking about these guys that are being managed according to that policy, these personal credit applications, the application has been received, and so therefore the event trigger has already been registered by Glass. Now, in some cases, those event triggers are happening thousands of times per day. If you are a financial services organization, you're getting hundreds, if not thousands, or even maybe tens of thousands of credit applications per day. You're not going to want to have a records manager manually trigger those. If you do, we've got a user interface for that. That's just as policy has an advanced policy screen, so does this inventory view that I've spent today showing you the simplified view on the portal. But there is an advanced inventory management view that allows me to trigger those events manually if the number of them is sort of manageable. You know, let's say that you are a midstream energy provider with 1,000 employees, and every week you have 2 or 3 employees join the organization and 2 or 3 employees leave it. Well, that's the kind of volume that a manual event trigger can handle. But if you're talking tens of thousands a day, then you're going to want to set up listeners, and Glass can automatically process those as they're emitted from PeopleSoft or SAP or Ariba or whatever is the system that is sort of creating and or managing those types of events. And then in that case, the life cycle is automatically triggered, and you don't need a person to be the intermediary. Another GDPR question. Okay, it's a US-based person who's heard of GDPR and wants more information on it. Okay, so I will get back to you on that. But just as an overall comment, I would say that GDPR is relevant. So it's a European set of mandates related to information privacy. That's the P in the GDPR. And there are some restrictions that companies that do business in Europe and or manage data that could be related to doing business in Europe, there are some privacy restrictions that are very heavy in terms of penalties if you don't comply with them. And so when we're throwing that term around, and I know a good portion of our audience today is US-based, I want to kind of assuage you if this is something that's not on your radar. Perhaps you need not worry about it. If you do, you know, I'd like to have the conversation with you, but don't sweat it if this is outside of your scope. Okay. We have reached the end of our time today, and I've addressed the majority of the questions. There are a couple of very specific GDPR questions and a handful of others that I'm going to follow up offline on, partly because answering them will take more time than we've got, and second, the specificity of the question necessitates a one-on-one conversation. So I'll beg your indulgence on that. Otherwise, thank you again for your time. We have not yet scheduled our next webinar. We've been doing these monthly, and here we are heading into July, and even now people are, I don't know about you, but I'm getting a lot of out-of-office replies. So we may not have one in July for holiday purposes. So kind of stay in touch on our socials in order to keep up to date on that. Otherwise, we will have the recording of this session available before the end of the week, and we will distribute that link to all of you who have dialed in here, and certainly the registrants who were unable to join us today, and then it can be shared as you see fit. Thanks again for your time, and thanks again for your interest in GlassIG and our technology. Have a great rest of your day. Those of you in Europe, a great evening, which I guess is about to kick off, and those of you elsewhere, take care, and thanks again.